So here I've put up my screen in front of you. And the first thing that you're going to see is actually that, so we're looking at Mark chapter 4, verses 1 through 2. And in a minute, you're going to see that we're in Luke chapter 22 and John chapter 11, Matthew chapter 26. Now, I draw your attention to that because in just a minute, we're going to look at a little bit later in the text and how part of the story is recounted in a different part of Luke's gospel. Now, what we can do as we kind of go through this, what we get to do is we get to compare the different gospels and their different accounts of what they are saying. And so I'll just give you a couple of examples. If we start using Mark as our basis here, you begin to compare what some of the commonalities are in the different gospels. And you'll notice that Mark tells us it's Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Luke makes mention only of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which is called the Passover. Mark says it just a little bit differently. Mark maintains the distinction. Luke uses the term synonymously. You'll notice that in the different Gospels, Mark tells us that the chief priests and the scribes are seeking how to arrest him and to kill him. And Luke says something, or Matthew says something similar, that they want to kill him there. So there's a similarity there. And in all three of we call these three the synoptics, in all three of them, they're looking, the authors note that they fear the people. There'd be an uproar among the people. Matthew recounts it almost word for word from Mark. Not during the feast, lest there be an uproar from the people. And you can see Mark is almost a word for word account of that. Part of the reason for that comes from the way that we get the Gospels. It's generally agreed upon that Mark was the first gospel to be written, and that the other Gospels then borrowed their material from Mark. And it's not that they changed it, but they adapted it so that it would suit their own purposes in writing. So, Mark gives us a little more detail. It's 2 days before the Passover, the Feast of Unleavened Bread. The Matthew also notes that it's Passover, by the way. Luke includes Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Also, you'll notice that Matthew says it's after 2 days, the Passover is coming. So similar language there. We go to the next, oops. Now here's where it's interesting, because I said a moment ago that Luke's gospel suddenly is different. We've gone backwards in Luke's gospel. In other words, the first part of the text that matches up with Mark's gospel is from Luke chapter 22. But then the remainder here in Luke's gospel is actually from Luke chapter 7. So what Luke has done is he's kind of, well, there's a couple of possibilities. One of the possibilities is that Luke is describing two separate events. In other words, Jesus was anointed at two different times. That certainly is a possibility. The other possibility is that Luke is he's got two different purposes, and he feels, and he has the literary freedom to move around the events in order to make and emphasize the point that he wants to emphasize. So if you look now in here, again, you see while he was at Bethany, Matthew, in the house of Simon the leper, almost word for word again in Matthew and in Mark's gospel. Matthew and Mark's gospel follow pretty similar. It's interesting that you notice in John's gospel now where John recounts things differently, but you'll notice that John tells us that it's Mary, and in the three synoptic gospels, you actually don't get that information. You're just told that it's a woman, and in Luke's gospel, it's a woman of the city who was a sinner. And so Luke's gospel, in telling this story, is actually a little bit different. Luke wants us to focus on the lowly nature of who this woman was. And that seems to be consistent with Luke's overall purpose. Luke is trying to show us how the gospel comes for and how Jesus cares for people who are on the margins. And so Luke tells this just a little bit differently. We don't get that information in Mark's gospel. We don't get it in Matthew's gospel. But Luke tells us about her social status. John makes it more personal and emphasizes that this is Mary. There is, again, this is sort of one of those places that raises the question, was this two separate events? It's a little surprising that Mark or Matthew or Luke, for that matter, don't give us a name, especially given that the woman in question was someone so well known to Jesus and his disciples. And so that lends some support to the idea that this was maybe a separate, these are two separate instances that are being recounted. But I'm not sure that that's definitive, because I think there's no reason to conclude that that Mary is the same person told in each of these accounts. You'll notice in Mark's gospel, again, in all cases, they come with ointment, you'll see, and Mark emphasizes the kind, it's pure nard, it's very costly. Mark is emphasizing, you'll remember that Mark is emphasizing the value or the preciousness of that, the way that this woman views Jesus as precious as she does. And so Mark makes sense then that Mark would emphasize by repetition here the word very pure nard, very costly. And in Luke's gospel, that's not the case. We just read that she brings an alabaster flask of ointment. It's clear that especially in this, you see that Luke shows clearly that the woman dearly loves Jesus. But the difference here is that when Luke goes on to retell this story, and you'll see more about that in a minute, Luke actually puts the focus on Simon the leper, the host family, the host's response to this. And you're meant to contrast the host response, who doesn't, Simon the leper doesn't do anything to welcome Jesus into the home, whereas the woman, still unnamed in Luke's gospel, actually pours out her tears and washes his feet and pours the ointment on. So there's again that different focus. In Mark's gospel, you don't see that. Mark is just the expense of the perfume is what is actually emphasized here. The response is interesting. I'm going to just clear the screen a little bit. So the response of the disciples is interesting. So you read when the disciples saw it, and then in Mark's gospel there were some, and in John's gospel we actually find that it's Judas Iscariot who was about to betray him, who says, "Why was this ointment not sold?" In Luke's gospel, it's a Pharisee who makes that comment. And so it's a different, and actually in Luke's gospel, the response is more focused on if he's, doesn't he know what kind of a woman he's associating with? And the differences there, I think, I don't think any of those are contradictory. I mean, it's possible that on the one hand, you have Judas who starts grumbling, and then the other disciples start chiming in on it, and then a Pharisee makes a similar comment. That's a possibility. So just because there's differences in the account does not necessarily mean that there's a contradiction here. Again, the cost in Mark's gospel for this ointment could have been sold for more than 300 denarii. Here, it's just they could have been sold for a large sum and given to the poor. Again, Mark is emphasizing the costliness of this action, as opposed to Matthew. And Matthew doesn't seem to be making quite that same emphasis. Both Matthew and Mark make this comment, record Jesus' comment here: "For you always have the poor among you, but you will not always have me." Here again, almost word for word, except for Mark adds this little bit: "Whenever you want, you can do good to them." And both cases, both Matthew and Mark, be careful. Whoop. Let's clear the drawings. Both Matthew and Mark emphasize in the preparation for burial. Whoops. She's done it to prepare me for burial. She's anointed my body for burial beforehand. One last comment, I think, on the differences between the different gospels. Whoops. Is Luke's gospel goes on, as I mentioned a moment ago, and he gives this lengthy, oops, he gives this lengthy response to Simon, and the focus is on the contrast of the hospitality that's shown. Simon apparently does not recognize what he's been forgiven, and the woman does. And so the point in the story of, as Luke tells it, the point is that Luke wants us to compare how Simon the leper, as he was known, welcomes in Jesus to his home, but does nothing to show kindness or gratitude to him. There's a theory that says that Simon the leper was actually healed by Jesus. He was a leper, but apparently now he's been clean because he's able to host people into his home. So the theory goes that Jesus healed this man, and as a response to that, Simon is having the man into Jesus' home, but he does not do much to welcome Jesus in, and instead, he is focused on seeing that Jesus is coming into contact with this morally repugnant woman. And Jesus is making the point, Simon, you were once morally repugnant yourself. You were a leper. You would have been excluded and ostracized. And here you've welcomed me into your home, but you haven't shown any kindness to me. And this woman, likewise, was morally sinful and a woman of the city and a prostitute and so on. And she too has been cleansed in a more deep and profound way, and she's expressing her gratitude. And so that's the angle that Luke is bringing out, and that Matthew and Mark are not. They're not emphasizing that point. Matthew and especially Mark is emphasizing the point that the woman is showing her devotion and her love for Jesus, and by expressing that in costly devotion, by giving of something of great and infinite value. And so there's a difference there. Again, that does not mean, and this is maybe a good point to end. None of this means that the Gospels are contradictory. None of this means that the Gospels are, invented stories. All of these actually can very easily be harmonized together. But it's just a case of different emphases. The authors, each of the four authors of the Gospels, are telling the story of Jesus for a different purpose and for a different reason. And so they all have a different way of crafting and editing their narrative to emphasize their point and to make the point that they're talking about. So one of the things you can always do when you do any kind of Bible study, it's always good, I think, to compare, as you're able to compare the different accounts of the same story in the life of Jesus and find out what do you notice that's different and what's the same in each of the stories, and you can learn a lot from doing that. Well, thanks for joining me again on this episode of The Cutting Room Floor. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time on The Cutting Room Floor.